Hey guys, so I'm going to do a review of the World Scrabble Championships. For those people in North America, this uses the Collins Dictionary, and therefore there may be quite a few words that you're not used to and are not valid in North American play. So, it's just worthy to be mindful of the dictionary differences. This is between Mark Nyman and Brett Smitheram. Mark is very much an old school player. Brett's much more of a new school player. Not so much. Brett's more of a kind of an equity centric player. He does have some, board control things that he does as well. Mark, I'll be honest, I don't really understand Mark's thought process all that well, at least all of the time. He does have some definite old school tendencies for sure. But yeah, I'm not really quite sure of everything Mark's doing and why. You'd have to ask him. But yeah. Anyway, let's get into the games. And hopefully this will be at least somewhat insightful for some of you. So Mark gets started, CIIORVW. I think the traditional play is Vow here. You can trade. A lot of people don't trade often enough for these sorts of racks, and I do see why you don't want to keep CIIR, but I would be okay with it. I'd probably play through here. Vrow is okay too. It doesn't leave the same sort of hooks, and the overlaps aren't so good, but the leaves isn't so good. I would still definitely play through this rack. Mark decides to exchange. I think he keeps the R, and that seems okay. I would probably play through here, but it's not the end of the world. It's not that big of a difference. But yeah, I would definitely play through here. Brett also exchanges. He has AAEEIOT. He exchanges 5, keeping ET. I think it's totally standard, and I don't really have much to say about it. Very standard play. Mark has EFFGKRS, and he plays Kef. I'm not so much of a fan here. If I'm going to play through this rack, I'd probably play Keg just because of the synergy being a lot better and because the overlaps are a lot more difficult. And also you get the S hook on the front as well as the back. I think Kerfs is probably the play here if you think that Brett has a lot of S's, and I tend to think that's probably the case. So I'd probably be playing Kerfs here. If you're going to play Kerf or Kef or Keg, especially Kerf, I'd probably move it over. I'd probably play Kerf over here. Which actually would have ended up pretty badly. But to avoid the S-hooks, if that's what really Mark's concerned about, that's one way of going about it. But yeah, I think that if you're going to play through, you should play Keg, and if not, you should just flat-out exchange. But that's not what happens. Mark plays Kef, and I think it's okay. Brett plays Whiniest. I think that's kind of interesting. I'm not sure why. Whiniest does lead to a little bit more of a board because you have the T here, and you can make plays over here, and you can open up all the quadrants pretty easily. That being said, something like Entwine, I guess that's actually wrong. Entwine like that scores quite a bit more. And I think it's probably even better positionally in some ways. You do have this Kef's hook that's going to stay open until it gets taken. Not sure why he played Whiniest, especially considering what Mark's play kind of at least sort of implies. It sort of implies at least a decent rack that has some sort of bingo potential through, the INI part of it. The E is already open. I guess it doesn't take an S hook, but I don't think that's that big of a deal. So I would prefer Entwine. I think that most people will play Entwine, but it's not what Brett does. Brett plays Whiniest. Mark plays Friggs, CFGQRRS. I actually don't recommend this. I don't think this is a very good play actually at all. CRQ is really, really bad, and it's really, really bad on this board. It's probably even worse, and you're losing, so you don't really have a lot of flexibility. it's going to be pretty hard for him to get rid of these tiles really at all. I guess you have some sort of like Corf options and things like that. It's just not enough. The options you're going to be left with after this turn with the Q are pretty abysmal. And even if you draw a U somehow, your options are still abysmal. The Q is much worse on this board than it normally is, and you just need the entropy that comes from exchanging here. You need to keep something like RS, and you need to actually create some sort of dynamic that will create a much more friendly board to you. Friggs also does limit the top right quadrant quite a bit. It's pretty hard to extend out there and score at the same time. Yes, the S is open, but the S isn't going to be open that long. It doesn't score all that well. And I just think there's a lot better options for creating a much more friendly board for your rack. So I definitely lean towards exchanging in this spot, and I think that that's almost certainly the best play here. And I think it's actually a pretty big difference. Kef I could live with. The exchange I could live with. This I not so much can live with. I think this is pretty mandatory that you need to exchange here. Brett draws pretty badly. He could play through here with Evove. Evove over there keeps A in, but it also opens the board in a way that's really not all that pleasant. Mark actually has a pretty decent range after Friggs, in theory, even though he doesn't in this case. And you're creating spots and openings that you really don't want to create. Yes, this does block a little bit of the top left quadrant because you don't have to deal with the re-overlaps of, let's say, something like, bit and having to deal with ski and stuff like that, or, all that sort of thing. So it does, close the board a little bit by doing that, but you're creating so much space on the bottom that's somewhat difficult to access. It can be closed on future turns in theory. So I'm definitely okay with exchanging here, even though it's not the equity valuation play per se. I think it's perfectly reasonable. He kept E in, by the way. Probably makes sense. Yeah, and there's not much to say about that. The A is slightly better than normal, but you don't really want to keep two vowels, and the A is still not as good as the E is here. Mark continues to play through. I think this is really an old school thing that old school players really like to play through in spots like this. As you can tell, I really don't. There's really not a lot of other options, I guess, but you don't have an S. Your leave is even worse now because you have the J, which still has no legitimate spots. Yes, your opponent does have a pretty random rack, and you might be able to get away with this a little bit because you can just start over paralleling, and you can exchange on future turns, and the F's the best scoring spot. But it's still not really worth it. You also break up CH. You can keep you only have to exchange here and keep CHAR, and that's a pretty decent option. The CH actually works pretty well with the F. And yeah, there's pretty good options here. So I would definitely lean towards exchanging here as well. But it's definitely not Mark's mentality to do that. People, especially old school players, that like scoring a lot, even at the expense of their leave. Brett draws pretty well. He draws a bingo and he plays a toners. I don't know how I feel about toners. Earstone certainly scores more. But, the same problem with Evove. It opens the board in a way that's not all that pleasant. Mark's range is still fairly decent. When I keep saying Mark's range is decent, I mean, he's an old school player, so his ranges, old school players' ranges are a little bit worse than newer players are. So his range might not be all that great. That being said, if you go to the computer, his options really aren't all that great. And there's really just not much else he can play that makes much of any sense. So even though Toners leaves all of those overlaps, I'm pretty okay with it. Just because there's not really all that many great options. Especially if you're against a strong bingo range, which I think Brett certainly is. Mark plays Qua. CEIJQRU. I think this is probably another mistake, to be honest. And I know I'm hammering on Mark pretty hard here. Standard play is certainly going to be Ko-Key over here. It keeps JER. Yeah, it doesn't bingo, but it creates some lines along column C and column E that are fairly decent. The J can still sort of score, at least somewhat decently. You can also consider something like Aji over here. Creates a decent Q spot, doesn't create too much scoring. Opponent's rack is basically random here, so it's not all that bad to leave that lane open. Brett can also get a little bit paranoid about this lane, given that your last two plays were Friggs and half. So you're actually projecting a much stronger range than you actually have here. I think both of those plays are probably better than Qua. Qua does leave the J open for these overlaps here, but I don't think that those overlaps are going to stay there anyway. I think almost 100% of the time, if you leave them open, Brett's going to block them very, very shortly. Certainly, if not next turn, the turn after that. So I'm not sure that that's all that strong of an option. Brett plays hoveling. There's been a word he might have actually played hoteling here, but it really doesn't matter. Both plays are essentially the same. Pretty mandatory, not much to say about that. Excuse me. Mark plays Joe. Again, pretty mandatory, not much to say. He's behind by over a bingo, and he needs to bingo very, very shortly, and this is probably the best way to do that. Brett plays mate. There's a case to be made. Mate takes an A front hook, so there's definitely a case to be made for something else like met. You know, it does keep worse, but it does keep overlaps that he has. You know, he has U and A that can underlap. Things like that, and just makes it a lot harder to access the bottom of the board, like we were saying before. Also, somewhat reduces some of the high-scoring F4 plays. So over here, after mate, he could play something like, you know, he could play some sort of like 40 or even more, something with the Y or something with the D, something like that. And Mark could definitely even have both of those hooks, whereas Brett pretty much can't. I guess Mark can't have the Y. He can have the D, though, for sure. And he can always draw it as well. The A is you might say that the A isn't that big of a deal, but it actually kind of is. Because it's hard to block when you don't get there. If you don't draw the A, then Mark can certainly draw the A. He doesn't have to play it there. He can keep it for a few turns. And it's just some sort of recurring threat that is a little bit dangerous. And the A is just a good tile here. Especially with the overlaps, you know, after met, you know, the Hota hook and all that sort of stuff. So I definitely would lean towards that. I don't think it's a big mistake, but I think it is a somewhat relevant difference here. Mark is starting to get desperate here. He kept CEHIR and he drew WI, which is pretty terrible. Not very many good options. You know, he could score with the, you know, F4. He could make something like War over here. I think that's okay. He can also play Iwi. Opens the board a little bit. I probably actually slightly prefer that just because this immediate scoring and blocking options are, you know, a lot weaker in general. You know, it opens the bottom right quadrant, which I think is pretty important here. He needs to access that quadrant at some point, and you know, I guess you do close the K9 opening, but I don't think it's that big of a deal. I don't think you have a rack that's going to get there anytime soon. But I think Kiwi's fine. You know, I don't think it's that big of a mistake. It's going to be hard no matter what he does here. it doesn't really matter. I think Kiwi's perfectly reasonable. I don't really want to say something's a mistake when I don't really know. I think it's kind of a borderline, and I've been picking on Mark a lot this game. So yeah, Kiwi's reasonable. Brett has a pretty decent rack and plays Sundry. He sacrifices a lot of equity to do that because he has a lot of better scoring options. Play red over here, scores 30. Another option is you can play in runs over here. He keeps the D for that, keeps the D for over here so he can have some sort of overlap over here next turn. I think that's at least reasonable as well. It's really just about board dynamics. So in runs, makes the bottom right pretty hard to access, whereas Sundry makes the bottom left harder to access. In runs does block the A hook. It blocks that, which is pretty useful because the seventh tile doesn't reach anymore. So that's a case to make in runs versus Sundry. You could also just outrun even after red. Even if Mark bingos twice, it's going to be pretty difficult for him. I think all options are okay here. Sundry really does create a problem for Mark because when you make some sort of overlap next turn, like, I don't know, even something as simple as Rin over here, or I guess you don't want to keep the R, but, Vin over here or something like that, it makes his life really, really difficult. But basically a good theme and pretty good board control on a board where it's going to be very hard for Mark to bingo in the future. Mark gets bitchier down, nothing to say, standard. And Brett plays Azon. I think this is really the first complete mistake that Brett's made this game. The much more preferable standard play is Azim over here. I'd even prefer Anime over here, just because it makes it a lot harder to bingo and because the Z has really good scoring and setup potential. So there's a very good chance that he's going to get to use the Z for a lot of points in the future and create a threat that Mark has to deal with that's a lot more threatening. That being said, I still would prefer Azim. Yes, it does make it a little bit iffy that, if he draws badly, he might have to exchange or not get quite as many points. But he's scoring 15 more points immediately. At the very least, he gets something like Ooh over here. If not some sort of strong blocking play, which is really what he's going to probably be going after. And I just think it's too many points, and there's too many plays that parallel after Azon that score a lot, that it just makes a lot more sense to not leave those sorts of parallels over. It's not really the points, it's the opening that Azon leaves, and for those reasons I think that Azon is a much stronger play. Mark plays Unsai. I think it's alright again. I think that maybe, I don't know, I kind of like to keep that R open. The C and the I aren't really very good bingo lines at all. And it's pretty easy for Brett to just block everything. So I prefer something, I prefer the much more standard scoring plays and just leave things the way they are. Lead is probably the most standard play by far. It scores far better. I think that's a much standard line. If you're going to play something like that, I want to make some sort of hook that makes sense of something like Dulce or Dunce over here. I guess Dolce. At least it leaves an E for row 15, which is a lot better than the I, and the I is obviously because you can reach the triple. So I prefer those plays over Unsai, but I think Unsai is okay. Keeps a better leave, I guess. Things are going to be really difficult for Mark regardless. Brett plays on body. I think that's standard. It's standard at this point. At this point, it's just about not screwing the game over, and Embody is going to pretty much spell the end of this game. Mark plays ahead, basically just desperately opening a triple. I think it's fine. I don't think he's going to win this game anyway. Brett plays Verily, and this game is just about over. Lure and Zap, and yeah, the rest of this game is over. It's not really much interest, yeah, it's just over at this point. So that's game one. And let's look at game 2. So game 2 is probably... It was the closest of the 3 by far. And it actually has a lot of very, very weird plays in it. I looked at this game briefly already. It's by far the closest game, but... Brett opens eel. I think exchanging EE is standard. You can also play EE, I guess. The L is just a really good tile with EILRT. You can also exchange E. I think that's actually okay. But I think the standard play is to exchange EE here. Leader's just a really good leave, and you don't generally want to play short on the opening, especially for 4 points with 2 vowels. It's almost never correct to play short with 2 vowels. And EL just leaves a lot of ways for Mark to close the board, and a very good knowledge for Mark of what Brett has. You never really want to flip your rack over if you can help it. Mark plays Albugos. I think that's standard. Yeah. Well, it's not standard. The one issue with Albugos is it leaves the U open in really one of the worst spots on the board. It keeps XU plays open. It keeps JU and QU plays open. It's not like Brett has those very often. So I guess it's fine. The kind of nice thing about Albugos in the other spot, or sub-goal, is that it does a better job of closing quadrants. I guess sub-goal takes an S-hook, so that's kind of scary, so I can see why he didn't do that. Albugos is actually decent because it tends right. The L, the B, the U, they're all plays that are going to extend to the top right quadrant. And because of that, you can actually make parallel plays and close the top left quadrant fairly comfortably. At least some of the time. That and the fact that you're just not going to get as many double doubles along row 5 kind of makes it a little bit preferable. I guess there's a lot of hooks that go in front of eels, and that might be a reason why not to do that. But so I guess I have a slight preference towards Albugos there, but I don't think it's a really big difference at all. Brett plays Uoi. I don't know how I feel about this play. I really don't like keeping an opening like that, and EIRT is all of a sudden not a very good board after Uoi. The E's closed, the L is at least inhibited. Mark's going to get a decent score almost no matter what he does, and things might get tough after Uoi. It's just not a very open board in terms of the ability to make leaves accessible. That being said, there's really not a lot of good plays that do create a more open board. Toile at least keeps an E-hook, but I think that E-hook isn't going to stay there because it takes a lot of back hooks. It takes a T, a D, an R, an S, and it just keeps a worse leave, so I don't really want to do that either. You can actually exchange, but that doesn't seem so great. But yeah, there's really just not a lot of good options here. You could play something like through the L, and yeah, you create a more open board, but you create scoring options and just a worse leave in general. So it's kind of like one of those cases where there's just really not a lot of good options. So, Uoi is okay. I can see the case for other plays as well, but I think it's at least reasonable. Mark plays Flatworm. I'm pretty sure he just misses Wormel, which is a much stronger play here. Opens a lot less in terms of 8s. And in terms of parallels, Flatworm actually takes a lot of parallel options that are going to score fairly decently. You do create scoring spots when you're ahead, which is definitely a good thing, but it's just such a sacrifice in terms of, leave, and, Brett just drew 3 tiles, so he's going to have a decent option almost no matter what he does. So yeah, I would say that's not my favorite play. I would definitely prefer a Wormhole here. Brett plays Uteri. I don't know. I'd probably continue fishing. I know that I said that there's not many spots for, EIRT last turn, and the board really hasn't changed that much, and I still want to keep and fishing plays are still going to keep that. A play like, Utu over here is still going to have the same problems as before. But at least you have some re-overlaps. Uteri keeps UT, which is awful. You're only scoring 12 more points by doing it. And at this point, you need variance. And Uteri doesn't have that much variance because the leave is so bad. EIRT might not hit as often as usual, but still hits, I would guess 35% of the time, something like that. And, you're behind by 120 on a board that's not very good, so you need something that both bingos and creates a better board for you. So I would prefer Utu for sure here. I'm sure, yeah. I don't really see Uteri being all that useful in the long term. I think it's going to be very difficult. We could do probably some computer analysis and you'll give us a better idea. But yeah, I'd prefer Utu for sure. The computer also prefers Utu for what it's worth, but I don't think it really, I see what you're doing. You're trying to create the R that sort of creates an opening, but the difference in leave is just too much. So I definitely prefer Utu here. Mark plays Cheen, or Kin, I guess. I don't know how you pronounce that. I definitely prefer Relook. I don't think it's even close. It's not because, the Q can definitely improve. You could draw an I and you could have QI in a bunch of spots, or even QU. You could draw U for certain. That spot's almost always going to be there now, and you're actually blocking a lot more bingo lines by doing that than playing QIN. The R's still going to stay there, and you're going to need to block it eventually. And yeah, you're killing all the bingo lines, and there's just a lot more potential for the rat to get better. It's really hard for EKLOO to score more than 40 points. What are you going to draw that's going to really make it all that much better? Well, I guess you could draw an A and you can play Oak next turn, and that's going to score. Oh, you can't even do that. There's just no good way for that rat to improve, whereas there's lots of good ways for the Q to improve. And yeah, so I definitely prefer Relook. I don't even really understand the point of Cheen. It's just going to get worse. I guess you make sure that you get rid of the Q, but even after something like Relook, and even if the Q spot gets blocked with something, then you just continue blocking the board. You play down row O or something like that. It's a really, really good situation, and you get to really limit the board a lot with Relook. Whereas, you kill the entire top right quadrant by doing that. So I don't really see the point of Cheen. I think you're just not getting as much as you could possibly get out of that. Brett plays Quant. I think that's clear. Nyman plays Relook. I think that's also clear. I think he should have done it last turn, but yeah. Notice that he did draw the I, so this is actually a pretty big difference, and maybe game costing. Not directly because he's still ahead by 132, but I think that this is a play that was very, very questionable. Brett plays OO. Wiped, I think is not much to talk about here either. And Gain. I think Gain is pretty obvious too. He needs to create some sort of play along the left side and try to, create some space for the top left quadrant. So I think this is the best way of doing that almost for sure. Fizz, I think, is pretty is pretty mandatory. You can make a case for Fez just because of the better bingo line, because it closes the top. It does a little bit more to make sure that the bottom left quadrant is closed. Any sort of bingo that plays along here is actually pretty dangerous because it creates so many bingo lines at once. So, for example, I don't know, I'm just making something up, revising. All of a sudden the entire bottom left is open, whereas if you play Fez here, then even if a bingo comes in column N, it's very easy to parallel and very easy to close. So in some ways, it's actually better to leave that open, and you're keeping a better leave, but, you know, I think it's perfectly fine either way. I don't think that Fizz is mandatory, but I think Fizz is fine. I think Fez is fine as well. But Mark does go with Fizz. Brett bingos with Lysates. I think it's pretty obvious. And Mark plays Trended. Now, there's a lot of options here, and I think that this is probably one of the key plays of the game as well. Things do go very, very badly for here after Mark. Spoilers. I think this play is okay. One of the things that people said is it plays 6 tiles. I don't think that's that big of a deal. I don't think that turnover is really all that important here. It does help a little bit to get to the end of the game, but I don't really think it's that important. I think what's more important is shaping the board in such a way that it's going to be good for you. And like I said before, plays that play down this are actually kind of problematic. Although not so much here, because now Lysates creates a second parallel, so there's a lot less room for those bingos to really affect things. There's a few other options. Dent is a decent option, but Dent actually leaves a lot of reparallels. It's actually pretty easy to make a 7 fit over there, so it's not all that great in that regard. There's also decent bingos with the TE and the E, and that's sort of dangerous, so I think that Dent, and it also creates a 3 consonant leave, so there may be some inflexibility coming up if you play Dent. So I'm not sure I'm that big of a fan of that. Also, the ST is, you can also bingo through the ST, which is a little bit problematic. I think Trended is okay. I actually think an interesting option that wasn't considered really by anybody here is Trended over here. One of the main themes of Scrabble, especially in a dictionary that has a lot of words, is that you really want to exhaust space. And Trended starts exhausting the bottom left area of the board. It really does kill the bottom right as well. It's going to be pretty hard for anything to happen in the bottom right. It really does wreak havoc with the bottom of the board. Yes, there are things like IER bingos, but it's so hard to hit stuff like IER bingos. And even if they do, it's going to create such good counterplay. And it's going to create an easy way to block the top left. And just going to exhaust the entire board. It's a really good way of actually creating a much more closed dynamic in, through exhaustion, which I think is really, really important here. I actually think I prefer this. It's a very, very weird option. It's a very unique option for sure, but it really does wreak havoc with the board in a really serious way here. Both in terms of long-term bingo lines and immediate-term, immediate bingo lines. It's gonna be very hard for Brett to do anything after Trended positionally. And yes, it does score 10 less points, but I think that's probably the best option. I certainly think that Trended and what Mark does is actually perfectly reasonable. And even if it's not what I'd play, I think that it's definitely minor in terms of it's definitely a very small mistake. The fact that it ends up so badly for him is really just coincidental, but Trended does leave the bottom left open, which is, I think, the big problem here. Yes, it does close the E in Sealy, but bingos ending in E are going to be hard to stop. I think that's really the problem. And then once you do that, it's going to be really hard to close the rest of the board off, and really easy for Brett to continue making more bingo lines, especially on the right side of the board. You can play through the ED in Trended, and then Mark has to close that, and I think I just think it's too problematic in that regard. It just gives Brett a lot of play. Brett plays Eric. We're pretty sure this is rack. We're not 100% sure this is his rack. if this is his rack, I think that he missed what is clearly the strongest option in Irenic here. Irenic takes an S hook. There's only one S left. So I think that it's clearly the best option. It's going to be very hard for Mark to... Mark's going to have to do something about that and probably not score very well. And Irenic just scores a lot more than Eric does. That being said, Eric does make it a lot more likely he's going to bingo. So I think it's definitely okay. He has good options. You know, he keeps AEIR, which has very good options. You know, very good options to this, you know, this line and this line, and to the C. So, you know, even given Irenic, I think that Eric is probably okay too. I think it's pretty close. Mark plays cup. I'm not really sure what I'd do here. It's pretty close as to what to do here. Mark's ahead by 115. And, yeah. Really, cut just doesn't do anything. You can play uncap here, but uncap kind of is the same play as cup for the most part. And on one hand, you do want to close the board. You want to kind of take stuff out. Or you could just outrun. You could play Japan, and then you have the A that you could potentially score to. But then you're going to feel really stupid when he plays it. You know, if he ever plays a triple, or even if he just plays a bingo, you know, to the C, just in general. Then he's going to have, you know, the G in gain, and then he's going to have, you know, stuff that hooks the T in trended. Yeah, you might outrun a lot of it, but, you know, it seems like it's a little bit risky. Another option, which I didn't, you know, which is going to be definitely unconventional, but I think definitely reasonable, is Taj, which blocks the things that parallel trended. It blocks Eric, and it makes it very hard to continue opening the board. The J does wreak a lot of havoc. Might not leave the best, but it's going to be very hard for Brett to come back after Taj, just because the board is just a mess. You know, Taj just obliterates the board. I think that Taj is better than cup. Probably what I'd play. I do think Japan is also fine. And I think even uncap is probably fine. But, yeah. Yeah, and I would probably not play cap or cup. I'd probably play Taj. But I do see the merits of, you know, cup does keep the J, keeps okay options for the J, and, you know, blocks the triple and high scoring bingo possibilities. So on that sense, it's fine. Feel bad for obliterating Mark. I haven't agreed with very many of Mark's plays at all. I've just noticed. But yeah, Brett plays. This goes very, very wrong for Mark very quickly. Brett plays Hardy's, and Mark then plays Java. We don't know what Mark's rack is exactly, and with a lot of racks, I do want to talk about this. With a lot of Mark's racks, Java's probably not a very good idea. Let's put in the... And I want to talk about this a little bit. I think it's probably one of the most interesting plays in the game. It's really unfortunate we don't have Mark's entire rack. But let's put in the pool. Give me a sec. So here's the pool. And this is an idea of what Mark has, or of what Mark might have here. And he's up by, as you can see, 55. So as you see, there's 18 tiles in the pool. And this means that when you play Java, there's 15 tiles in the pool. That means it's 7 on Brett's rack and 8 in the bag. And that means that if Brett bingos next turn, there's 1 in the bag. which is not particularly good for Mark. He really would like to play 4 tiles here, if at all possible. So on that level, this might not end very well. There's plenty of places to play. You can't really block. You have the G and then you have the E. So the E is more threatening, the G scores more. You can try to create some sort of like dual option sort of thing, but even with a rack like this, you might want to consider something like Davin. You can also just limit his scoring options by creating some sort of setup so that the E bingos are kind of mitigated. You could play something like Deva and then create a spot for JA over here. And if he bingos to Devas, you get the triple and just outrun him a huge percentage of the time. So I think that's also reasonable. But yeah, it's really, really tempting to try to get the bag to the right, endgaming timing just seems so important here. That being said, the chances are very good that Mark couldn't have done anything that played 4 tiles that was even decent. So on that level, what are you going to do? I mean, I guess you could play with something like this, you could play Vanda, but then you're keeping JV, and if they bingo to the G, you're probably just screwed with JV. You're probably not going to be able to do anything. So yeah, you get end game timing, but you do it at the cost of probably completely obliterating your rack. It's hard to say. This doesn't end up working out for Mark, but it's probably, we don't know what he had, so given that, it's probably a good play. It's probably the best option that he had. He might have had better options, and we'll just never really know. But yeah, Java does leave him open to the type of thing that happened, and he just happened to run into the bad part of what could happen. He just ran into it. It's just that simple. Brett plays Chinesia, and all of a sudden, Mark is in a lot of trouble. So let's put in the pool again. So this time we do know Mark's rack, and he plays Vin. So this is kind of hard because Mark just went into, 2 turns ago he was in a position where he's probably about 95% to win, and now he's an underdog. Actually a very significant underdog. There are actually not a lot of plays that win him the game here. And Vin actually never wins him the game. He's actually dead no matter what's in the pool. Or what's in the bag. Wins, I understand the rationale. He wants to block things like mix, 6, something like that. But he actually just never wins. Too often, he's just going to run into something like Gox over here. Or, some play that... There's just too many options that he has. Mark's only option to actually win this game is a play like that, or that, and he needs to actually draw either the S or the O to win the game. The S gives him this, and the O gives him that. It gives him foe, and then there's another spot for this too. And that's it. I mean, he's an underdog here. He's just not in a position to win this game very often. And yeah, it's really unfortunate, but you kind of have to get yourself in that mindset where you went from a big favorite to a big underdog, and now Mark actually needs to draw something. He needs to draw the S or the O. And he doesn't have the luxury of blocking anymore. He's losing. He's a big underdog here. And even if he drew well, even if he drew the S, he's not winning this game. After Vin, he's dead. And yeah, it's tough, but yeah. Mark was also very low on time. I think that's part of this. And he's not somebody who actually calculates one in the bag end games. I don't think he goes and permutes through all of the tiles, which is something you really have to do if you're at a top level. You have to be able to sit down, write on a piece of paper, okay, if I draw the B, this is what I do. If I draw the G, this is what I do. If I draw the I, the M, the O, the R, the S, and the X. And you're really playing the entire endgame. You're playing 8 endgames here, and you're calculating all of them. And I guess Mark just didn't have the time to do that, and or just isn't somebody who considers that part of his overall pre-game strategy. I'm not really sure. But he played Vin. He played it very quickly. I think part of it was just being overwhelmed by how this game just went very, very bad for him very quickly. This game just ends very, very abruptly. Brett plays Brims, and this game's just over. Daw and Ox. Yeah. That's a very good example of how things can go very, very wrong. A lot of people say that's harder to play when you're behind because almost anything you do will win, but it's actually not. You actually have to calculate all the ways that they can come up, that they can come from behind. It's actually much harder to play Scrabble when you're ahead because you need to actually calculate a lot more things based on what they could have, what things can go wrong. Whereas the person behind, they just have to play their rack. They're just like, well, what do I do to come back? The person who's ahead, they need to think of all the things that can go wrong, not just with what their opponent has, but their opponent might have and what could happen in the future. It's much more difficult. And as a result, you get in a lot of situations where things are just a lot more complicated. And, you got into a lot of situations late where things just got really complicated and very, very technical. And sometimes if you don't know what to do and you do the wrong things, this can happen. Brett actually played this game very well. And in a lot of ways he deserved it. He deserved to win the game. He didn't draw that well. He was behind, he was behind 176 at one point in this game. And 3 bingos later, on a board where it's very hard to get 3 bingos, Brett hit 3 bingos and he won the game. And we're going to go to the final game now. Let me remove the pool. There was an X there, guys. Sorry about that. Let's just remove it entirely. All right. Game 3. Mark opens with UH off center. I don't really get it. I'm not gonna lie, I don't understand this play. If you want to do something creative, you could do something like hug. At least you have the G, so you can hit triples. But then I wouldn't do this either. I would just play UH in the traditional spot. I think that's standard, and I think that's what... I think it's standard, and I think it's standard for a reason. Brett plays Ova, and Ova's a very good play. I just want to talk about it briefly. Ova only takes an L hook, which Brett doesn't have, but it's a lot better than... Brett knows that Mark has a very strong rack, and so he doesn't want to leave an S hook, so that's why he doesn't play Avo. Even though, because he doesn't want to leave an S hook for it. And he wants to create it so it's as difficult for Brett to hit as possible. So if he plays Avo, or if he plays over here, then row 10 becomes an issue. Whereas over here makes it difficult for Mark to bingo, because Mark's range is very, very strong here. And while also leaving Brett very good counterplay in case Mark does open the board or bingo himself. So I think this is definitely the play. It's a very subtle and nuanced type of thing that a lot of people won't catch. A lot of people will just be like, oh, what's the difference? And make all sorts of other plays that are just much worse. They'd play something like Vag-Eye or something like that, which just gives Mark much better bingo opportunities. And, this is just a very, very strong play against Mark's range. And I think that it's a very good play that a lot of people will just very quickly overlook. Mark drops the A here. I think that's also a very good play. Gives him very good spots for earring to hit somewhere, either along row 9 or column K, without giving Brett too much to actually for himself, or giving him any sort of good overlaps either over or under the A and ova. Brett plays Fein. I don't like Fein too much. I actually prefer just FAA. Just create FAA in two directions. I think that's a little bit stronger. It does keep two eyes, but there's decent spots for I and G on this board. Two eyes isn't that bad. Yes, it does suck if he gets a third eye, but you can also bingo a lot more often than after Fein. And Fein just takes so many hooks, and it makes it just way too easy for Mark to bingo. If Mark has, even with the rack that Mark has with earring, there's a lot more options for Mark to bingo after Fa than there is after Fein. After Fein, he gets the end of playthrough and he gets all of those hooks. After Fa, he basically needs a 7 or, and a lot of the time he needs an S. So I think that's a lot stronger play. But, Fein works out, and yeah. Mark bingos with Ingrate. I think all the bingos are pretty much close to the same here. Yeah. I think it's fairly likely that Mark actually saw Fein and said that, and concluded that Brett has an eye a significant percentage of the time, which he does. He actually does have a second eye, and so he thought that the eye wouldn't be so threatening. There are a lot of eyes in Brett's range, so that's one reason to stick the eye up there as opposed to any other letter. Also makes triples very difficult. So yeah, I think Ingrate's fine. And I don't really have much else to say about it. Brett plays Kissed. Standard plays probably Kaye. Yeah. I think Kissed is okay. Blocks some of the good, It scores a few more points. It balances a lot better. It gets rid of the G, which isn't a particularly good tile. But I don't know. I don't think it really makes that big of a difference here. Mark bangs with Dartle. I think that's standard. I think that's placement's also standard. Brett Bang goes back with Piriagua. I think that's also standard. Not much to say about it. And Mark bingos with Tarrares. Not too big of a fan of this. I think that Septari is a much stronger option. Or Aspirate is even a better option. Aspirate gives some really, really hefty parallels, so I don't like it nearly as much as Septari. I think that's the play. Yes, it creates a very open board. Well, maybe not a very open board, but it does create a lot more opportunities on the bottom of the board, which is otherwise pretty closed down, whereas Terraris doesn't do that. But I don't think it's that big of a deal. There's still plenty of ways to get to the bottom of the board. And this configuration just doesn't lead to closing the board that drastically. It's going to be very hard for him to do it even after Terraris, really. After Terraris, let's say that Brett has a bad rack and plays to the S, then Mark has to go and play through that and not leave an S hook down there. There's a blank left. He has to stop people from hooking. He has to stop bangos here and to the K and just all sorts of stuff. The C is still open. It's going to be very hard to actually do that, and you're sacrificing a lot. Whereas Septaria, it's not going to open that much. He's going to get, Septaria is going to lead to play over here, but that's plenty blockable. It's just not that big of a difference. Neither play would have actually probably worked out because Brett plays Brackenid, which is very, very devastating. And all of a sudden, Mark's winning chances have plummeted. They're not good pretty much no matter what he does here. Yeah. Some technical things. This game gets very technical, as do most games that are actually... When one player's ahead, actually, the game gets very technical very quickly. Plays Mode. I'm not too much of a fan of Mode. Yes, it is standard. Yes, it scores more than anything else, but it also makes it very easy to close that side of the board, which is very bad. He needs to create options and leave options out there. I much prefer something like Moa, something like that. At least it leaves that side of the board open for theoretical possibilities. Yeah, even if you're going to play out there, I'd prefer load. Gives the M. At least you get some idea of some good scoring options with the M. But yeah, this is just not a very good position. And Mo is definitely standard, and there's kind of a feeling of shock, especially when things have gone this wrong. Yeah. Brett plays Brick. I'm not too much of a fan of Brick. I would rather him play something else, probably. I guess one good thing about mode, I'll go back to it, is that a lot of the times what's going to happen is that there's going to be an overlap with the O, and Mark's going to get an overlap back. He's going to get to play low, and that's actually a pretty decent part of playing mode. But he has the Q, so he's not going to get the bingo out of it. So, yeah, I don't see it. I think he has to play something else. Brick does stop Mark from playing down to the K, but I think that's much more important to take care of. To take care of this threat as soon as possible. That being said, I'm not sure if there's a good way of doing that this turn. Let's see. Yeah, no, I guess Brick is okay. You want to stop bingos from really killing you here, but there's no real good way of doing that right now. So, yeah, I guess Brick is okay for now. You're just trying to prohibit him from opening the board south. You don't want bingos to come out in this area of the board, so... Yeah, for that reason, I think it's probably fine. Mark plays Lout. Pretty mandatory. You actually do want to keep the Q here. I mean, you don't want to keep the Q. You never want to keep the Q, but you're not going to get to bingo even if you have the Q. There's 2 U's left, so there's decent options when it comes to blocking in that regard. And yeah, I think it's definitely at least reasonable to keep the Q and hope to hit something either to the T or something. I want to say you want to hit something on this side of the board, but you actually don't, because, like I said, this side of the board is probably not going to stay open very long. You do want to create some sort of options over here if you at all can. Even something like Twill might even be worth thinking about. Just because, you create an S-hook out there, you create a QI spot, which you never, could definitely prove to be useful eventually. Twill's actually very hard to block as well. It's pretty hard to do anything about that S while scoring, and you might, you never know what will happen in that regard, and you probably, almost certainly, you're going to get a free 8-point, 31-point Q spot with probably a better leave than you have now. So in that regard, I think Twill might actually be a better option. But Loud's certainly okay. Loud's standard, and it's something that keeps the best leave and has some hope of winning the game. Brett plays Gox. I think Gox is definitely a mistake. I think the play for sure is going to be Oxes. Oxes gives good options to score with the X. It drastically reduces the amount of points that Mark can score bingoing over there, and it also scores it scores an additional point. So I think all of those things combined, I think Oxes is definitely a stronger play. Yeah, he can bingo through the O, but the bingos through the O for the most part are going to score like 60. And Brett's still up over a bingo at that point, and he can just close whatever opening Brett makes, or whatever opening Mark makes. I think it's a really strong play. It's gonna be very hard for Mark to come back after Oxes, whereas something to the Q or something like that could always happen wrong column B if you play Gox. So yeah, based on that, I think that Oxes is probably a stronger play, but I think that this is okay. It's hard to go wrong when you're up by this much. But thematically, I think you want to play Oxes. Mark exchanges. He's not in a very good position, to say the least. It's hard because you don't really know what you're going to get to play. It's really hard for a Q to hit the T, and the Q is just not likely to hit this spot. It's just not. And while the Q can hit this spot over here, this spot's probably not going to stay there, so you're going to probably have to hit something else over there. Or you're just going to have to hope that, Brett has plays that doesn't block there, but if he has plays that doesn't block there, it means that he can score very well in other places. So yeah, there's no good options here. There's just no good options here. You definitely want to keep QU. The I doesn't hurt either. The T... I think you should keep the T. I think the T's probably slightly worth it. I'd probably trade LLV here. You can hit stuff like equites or something like that. And, maybe something from the I or something ridiculous. Inequity. Yeah, those are all possibilities, but it's going to be hard no matter what. I think VLL is a little bit stronger than VL, but it's going to be a long shot no matter what he does here. Brett plays Matif. He's mostly just trying to outscore and get out of range here, but I don't think that's the best option. I think the best option is probably... the best option is Fate here. You could play Them, but that leaves stuff like equites and stuff like that. Fet is going to be really hard, because then you have to start a bingo with a U, or with a blank A, both of which are really, really hard. The pool is really not very good. Let me write out the pool for you real quick. Maybe not real quick. I'll just go through the pool. There's no A's in the pool. There's a blank. There's some S's, but there's also Q, V, Y, Y, Z, J, U, U, and there's no R's, and there's one T. So the pool is not very good for bingoing, and you're just stopping so many bingos after Fet. Whereas Matif, there are a lot of bingos that fit along row, column A, and granted they're probably not going to win very often, but Fet is going to make it almost impossible to bingo down there, and it's really going to be just almost impossible for Mark to win this game. We really are talking about the difference between 98 or 99% and 99.9% and 99.x%. But as you saw from last game, comebacks do happen, and I think that Fet makes it a lot less likely that this comeback will happen than Matif, just because it makes it so much harder for Mark to bingo along that line. So after Fet, even worst case scenario, bingos to the T, you block to the T, and it's just game over. I would guess it's less than 1 out of 1,000 after Fet where Mark comes back, whereas it's probably closer to 1 out of 150 or 200 after Matif. Small differences, but differences that definitely can happen. Mark plays QI. I'm not a fan. I think this is basically a resignation play. At this point, he may as well have just resigned. There's no way to win this game after QI. Yes, you're not going to get row A. This spot is going to be blocked immediately 100% of the time. But, you need to create some sort of option here. Give yourself at least some sort of hope. And there are ways to do that. They're not great ways, but there are ways. Something like tip, or if it's going to get blocked, at least block it yourself and give yourself an option that's hard to block, something like that. Again, not great options, but create some sort of diversion somewhere, something like that. There's options. You don't need to give up, but when you play QI, you're just never winning this. You can trade again. Yes, it's hard. Yes, you're probably not going to win. But QI is basically a resignation play, because now even 2 bingos isn't going to win the game. Your bingos aren't going to score enough if you get them down, and it's just over. Brett plays health, taking out the last bingo line. That's last good bingo line, makes sense. Lou comes down. Nothing's gonna win this game. So, in some ways, it's almost kind of insulting when Lou comes down, because you think Brett's gonna block it 100% of the time. It's like you're not gonna block this. Of course he's gonna block that, but I guess I understand. Marsh just gasping at straws at this point. John comes down, standard. XI just doing whatever pretty much. Trying to draw peyotes or XI, I spot or something like that. But even if he gets them, it doesn't matter. Zarino's just for the lols. And yeah. And Brett wins the 2016 National Scrabble Championship. So that's coverage. I think that Brett definitely deserved to win. I think Brett played a lot better than Mark did. I think Mark actually usually plays a little bit better than this. I think he was a little bit nervous. And his strategy isn't that conducive to the current metagame. Whereas Brett made mistakes, I think, but Brett's mistakes were a lot more. They were a lot higher level and they were a lot more complicated. Brett's actually a very good player when it comes to fundamentals. Brett has very, very strong fundamentals. He's not going to do anything that's too ridiculous. Sometimes he doesn't do things that are nuanced enough, or I think Brett could maybe work on his, making some of the really complicated, kind of weird-looking plays a lot more. Brett mostly just does what the computer does. With some exceptions, he does have some sort of awareness of, opening and closing boards and board dynamics and stuff like that. So, it's not just, computer things, but I mean, he also doesn't, at least to my knowledge, Brett can definitely exploit himself and definitely has numerous times. I haven't seen anything that's like extremely complicated in terms of like really deep theory from Brett. But you don't need that until, very, very, very few players out there, less than 5 have the ability to do that. So, and be right about it more often than they're wrong about it. So lots of people have the ability to do that, but their consistency at doing that is not the greatest. And Brett mostly just, from what I've seen so far anyway, is very, very rote, just does, okay, this is the theme I can do, and he just does it. And he does it very consistently and does it very well. And, Mark did a lot of things that were not what I would consider to be standard. And most of them didn't work. And they might have some validity. I don't know what Mark's thought process is for a lot of these sorts of things. But yeah, anyway, let me know if you have any questions or any comments. Hope this was helpful, at least gave you some sort of insight as to what people were doing and why they were doing, and some of the things that both players could have done differently. And yeah, until next time,